Hi, my name is Dr. Joe Denekamp from the Department of Management here at the Kelley School of Business. And today we're going to talk about how to handle complex decision making under uncertainty. And specifically our point of departure today is to think about strategy under uncertainty and how to look at how to tackle complex problems in uncertain environments. Our point of departure is going to be an article from Michael Porter where he talks about strategy as being the core of management. And specifically, Michael Porter says general management's core is strategy, defining a company's position, making trade-offs, and forging fit amongst the activities. So we have a complex environment, what the firm should do, how to bring together all the pieces of the puzzle, the operations, all of the finance, the marketing, how the firm operates and conducts its activities. And he said that the essence of bringing that together is really making trade-offs and forging fit amongst those activities at a specific position, defining a specific strategic view. Now, when we think about it, this is key. Operational efficiency, doing things well, is important, but it's only a threshold skill. The differentiating skill, the skill that really makes companies successful, are piecing together a good fit amongst those activities inside a complex environment and doing things differently than your rivals would do. And that's the essence of this. Unfortunately, in uncertain environments, this becomes much more difficult. So how do we tackle complex business problems under uncertainty? Well, the first step is to really understand what we mean by uncertainty. Hugh Courtney, in an article in the Harvard Business Review, talks about 4 levels of uncertainty. And the first level of uncertainty is a clear enough future. Now, thankfully, this is where most businesses operate most of the time. In some situations, we have alternate futures, or we may need to look at scenario planning under a couple of different contingencies, but we're able to do fairly well in these environments. Sometimes, however, we're not able to clearly identify what the scenarios are, and Courtney talks about this range of futures, which becomes a little bit more difficult to deal with, and sometimes we find ourselves in true ambiguity. We just don't know what the future is going to bring. So we need to be able to figure out how to balance rigorous decision making and fill in the blanks with creativity to be able to clearly identify these paths as we move along. Now, under type 1 uncertainty, it doesn't require as much creativity, and this is where the firm operates most of the time. All business environments are uncertain, so nothing's 100% sure, but usually a single point estimate of the future is enough. The information is knowable. We can use our scenario planning tools. We can figure out what the situation is. We can use capital budgeting. We can look at 1-year, 3-year, 5-year forecasts. And as the company moves along and the fit between the activities is reasonably solid and sure, it becomes a matter of adjusting relative to what the competition does. This is where most businesses operate, and the day-to-day activities really require little creativity in terms of the problem solving. Rigorous decision making is where firms operate best. But what happens when we introduce a higher level of uncertainty into the system and we start to look at alternate futures? Here we might have a few discrete outcomes. What's going to happen? Well, if the economy is solid, we have a clear path to the future. We're facing a little bit of economic uncertainty. We're not sure what the housing market might do in the future, and we may need to look at some different forecasts. So we begin to develop some alternate budgets. Our decision-making tools are still solid. We can use scenario planning, we can use weighted analysis, there's a number of different things that we can do, and we can hedge our bets by looking at these multiple outcomes. But even a small number of discrete choices can begin to increase this. If this branch had multiple decisions, and each one of those branches had multiple decisions, we might have a higher number of permutations than we feel comfortable budgeting. Under a clear enough path to the future, we develop one set of outcomes. This simple case with just 2 decision branches would give us 3 different outcomes. That's triple the amount of work. As these decisions become much more complicated, how are we able to balance out the branches that takes place? Well, that requires creativity. We need to be able to figure out what those important details are, and we need to figure out how to solve those problems, and we need to be able to figure out which of these problems is most important. So using creativity to minimize the amount of work we need to do and the amount of budgeting and planning and to understand the implications of these decisions is really where we start to balance good decision making and rigorous decision making with the higher order brain processes of creativity. Now, what happens when we're not able to identify discrete scenarios? What happens when we don't know what those decision points are going to be? In new markets such as entrepreneurship, as firms develop new products, as we reintroduce products in highly uncertain economic environments, we may not have a natural set of scenarios that fall out. The toolkit that we need to rely on then is a lot more creative. First, we need to figure out what those plausible scenarios might be. What are the driving variables behind the decision? What's really going to be the important piece? When Palm was trying to develop their initial PDA, they gave a block of wood to each of the engineers that was no bigger than the device. They had decided that the driving force was going to be size. Apple, in one of its missteps, said, no, we need to focus on the things that the people want out of the device. We need to focus on performance. And they let the engineers focus on the attributes of the device. And Palm said, no, we need to carry around this block of wood. And the driving force is going to be convenience. Now, remember the Newton was a device that looked like a small calculator, and they were trying to do a desktop computer device, but the people that were using it found it cumbersome and unwieldy and hadn't really appreciated that this was going to be a handheld device for note-taking. And in this rare case, Apple's misstep created an entry wedge for Palm, and we now see the PDA that has eventually developed into their smartphones and their Trios. They focused in on what the key driving force would be, and that set up a different set of scenarios for Palm, and that brought together a market success versus Apple that focused in on a different set of driving variables such as performance. So we need to create plausible scenarios out of these key decision variables. We need to isolate and forecast what those variables might be, and we need to understand the implications of those decisions. So Palm was more creative in understanding what the market desired. And often we see success or failure dictated by which of those decision variables the company brings to the top. Now, every once in a while we see true ambiguity. Very rarely exists, but we can't even figure out what the driving variables might be. We have no basis to forecast the future. And in Hugh Courtney's article, he talks about it happening very, very rarely, such as what would happen after the fall of the Soviet Union. We just didn't know. And in these particular cases, we really have to look to very high-order brain processes to try to draw analogies or to look at patterns. This looks like something we've seen before. And in those types of situations, these were the key decision-making variables. And we try to reduce type 4 uncertainty into a type 3 environment where we can look at the decision variables. And then by forecasting and choosing what those variables might be, we can then create an environment where we might be able to develop some plausible scenarios. Other cultures will look to seniority for wisdom. The older people in the group have seen everything before. They're the most likely to be able to figure out what the elements of uncertainty might be and what those key decision variables might be. And more importantly, often we need to look at just maximizing our probability of success. Those golfers in the audience, how often do you really look at the green and you want to know exactly what the grass is going to look like when you're standing on the tee of a par 5? It's important, but it's just too far in the future. There's too many steps of uncertainty to resolve. So we try to maximize our chance for success by just getting the ball in the fairway and then putting ourselves in a position to succeed later. And this is a good way to deal with type 4 uncertainty. Try to figure out what those patterns might be. Put yourself in the place of most potential. And then begin to think about what those driving decision variables would be. And at that point, you can begin to create plausible scenarios and hopefully begin to plan. This requires a high degree of creativity. So when everything is said and done, critical thinking alone is not enough. The higher degrees of uncertainty introduce complexity into the problem set. The traditional problem techniques become more and more ineffective. There might be too many alternatives for scenario planning. There might not be a basis for beginning the analysis, or there's simply too much uncertainty to have confidence in the outcomes that you've developed. When the data is incomplete or unattainable, or in the future's not foreseeable, creativity then becomes an essential part to decision making under uncertainty. To balance out strong creative decision making, with strong, rigorous decision making. And that will get you ultimately on a path of success. This is Joe Denekamp from the Kelley School of Business.